Morning people, welcome back to F Politics. Today, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt announced the spring budget, basically where the government announces new things it's going to do to help us and how it's going to tax people and businesses in order to pay for that help. Now there wasn't much in it to help us because it's the Tories, but I do want to discuss how BBC and Sky News handled it because we need to learn from that. Fortunately, Kay Burley gave us this beautiful little soundbite that describes everything that's wrong with UK politics.
Just reading on Twitter this morning how I am a Tory and a Labour mouthpiece in equal measure.
Balance.
My work here is done.
Okay, if you want my full explanation as to why 50-50 is not balanced when it comes to presenting the truth, click here. But as a quick example, if the news was to present the pros and cons of drinking bleach or arsenic as if they were 50-50, that would not be a good public service. But it's actually worse than that because today gave us an example as to why proudly proclaiming that you only get your ideas from Labour or the Tories as a journalist is kind of problematic. Because what happens if Labour policy and Tory policy aren't that different from each other? It gives you really weird scenes like this.
The new theatre release may be of particular interest to the Shadow Chancellor, who seems to fancy her thespian skills when it comes to acting like a Tory. The trouble is...
That's Tory Chancellor Jeremy Hunt attacking Labour Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves for acting like a Tory. And because the Tories finally decided to scrap the tax loophole for people who earn their money overseas, aka non-doms, Starmer said,
after years of resistance, to finally accept Labour's argument on the non-dom tax regime. Because with this pair in charge, it won't be long before they ask you to defend the removal of private school tax relief as well.
So Labour and Tory policies are now so similar that Labour is attacking the Tories for looking too Labour and the Tories are attacking Labour for looking too Tory, meaning that the two parties that could potentially hold power in our two-party system aren't that different from each other. For a journalist whose job it is to speak truth to power, to proudly proclaim that she's the mouthpiece for that power, do you see how that might not be ideal? Now here's why this matters to you, because according to the government's experts, the OBR, we are getting poorer, because GDP basically means the money in the UK economy, and
GDP per person continues to fall to a trough of 1.25% below its pre-pandemic peak in the middle of this year, and ends the forecast almost a full percentage point lower than we expected in November.
So we really need the government to start helping us, but as pretty much everybody said today,
there isn't going to be, we expect, any money really for public services in this budget.
So let's look at the explanation that big TV news channels like BBC and Sky News gave as to why the government isn't helping us.
The Chancellor has said that he wants to cut taxes, but the government also has a pledge to make sure that the national debt is on course to fall in 5 years' time. And it's the official forecaster, the Office for Budget Responsibility, who decide whether that pledge is being met. And that works out as a big constraint on what the Chancellor can do today.
The government has had very little headroom, to use the sort of the jargon that has become so widespread around these events. And that's dictated essentially by your forecast.
That's Richard Hughes, basically the boss of the government's experts, the OBR. And Jeremy Hunt himself also based his plans on the OBR and Richard Hughes specifically.
I start with the updated forecast from the OBR, for which I thank Richard Hughes and his team.
So the government's entire economic plan is based on what they think they can afford based on the estimates given to them by the Office for Budget Responsibility, led by Richard Hughes. And yet despite the hours of coverage of the budget that I watched today, I didn't see a single journalist mention that Richard Hughes also said this a few years ago.
Since the referendum, we've assumed in our forecast that leaving the European Union is going to reduce our long-run potential output by about 4%. And in our most recent forecast, as I mentioned, we think that the effect of the pandemic is going to reduce that potential output by a further 2%. And so far, the data that we've seen on the impact of Brexit, especially taking into account the fact that the new trading arrangements came in January, is broadly consistent with that assumption that we had, which is that it would reduce our long-run GDP by around 4%. Yeah, in the long term, it is the case that Brexit has a bigger impact than the pandemic over the long term.
And today, in the OBR statement, they confirmed that analysis and said that Brexit is only going to do even more damage as time goes on. And it's not like Jeremy Hunt doesn't know that himself. He admitted it in 2022.
And would membership of the single market be something that would boost growth and change our current economic outlook?
I think having unfettered trade with our neighbours and countries all over the world is very beneficial to growth. I don't think it's the right way to boost growth.
Compare this Jeremy Hunt tweet from 2016 with what he said earlier today.
Higher growth means more opportunity, more prosperity, and more funding for our precious public services.
And yet none of the TV journalists I saw today seemed to want to mention that. In fact, some of them even steered the public away from that. For example, the BBC's Faisal Islam, who normally is absolutely awesome on Brexit. In fact, I use him regularly as a source. But today...
To the public, to people at home, do they compare it to where we were 2 or 3 years ago? And do they pin what has happened in the global economy and the tax rises we've seen over the past 2 or 3 years, do they pin that on the government? The evidence in the polls, of course, that we can see is that they have blamed that on the government.
You see, he's actually implying there that it would be wrong to blame the shitty state of the economy on the government, that it's all just these global factors. Which, yes, it is, but the government has also hurt the economy via Brexit, via Liz Truss's mini budget. And over on Sky with Sarah Jane...
Why did it go to the Conservatives? What did the people of Grimsby want at that time?
They wanted what they voted for, and that was Brexit. Mm-hmm. Yeah. They wanted to see a reduction in immigration. They wanted to see the country come back to us again, and not be ruled by the bureaucrats in Europe, and stand on our own. And that's why they voted.
That's a voter in Grimsby, a northern fishing town that voted for Brexit, and all the evidence shows that Brexit has made fishing even worse in Grimsby, and he's explaining how he feels now. Now, he's not necessarily saying that he's angry at Brexit, but he's clearly angry at the Tories. But Brexit has objectively damaged their economy. It's made the cost of living worse. And yet, what does Sarah Jane Me say?
We lent it to the Conservatives on the promise that they would deliver on what their manifesto was going to be. And it got weaker and weaker and less.
They may well argue, in that time we've had, the cost of living, a war in Ukraine, we've also had the pandemic. Just finally, in terms of looking at this election, is it going to be voted for on local issues or international issues? Because you mentioned Brexit at the last election. We're talking about wars that are happening now, but do you think people are actually looking at the UK now and going, we're going to vote on personal issues to us, stuff that's affecting our local community, things like the cost of living?
She is overtly implying that Brexit doesn't affect the cost of living, that it's some international issue, not a local issue, even though Brexit for Grimsby is as local as it gets. And to go back a bit, her immediate reaction to that voter saying they weren't happy with the government because things were getting worse and worse and less, was to say, no, but we've had COVID, we've had the war in Ukraine, we've had the cost of living, basically implying that it's not the government's fault. In fact, that's almost word for word the same excuse that Jeremy Hunt started his speech today with.
In recent times, the UK and the UK economy has dealt with a financial crisis, a pandemic, and an energy shock caused by war in Europe. Yet despite the most challenging economic headwinds...
Now, you've probably heard me explain before how believing that because COVID and Ukraine have damaged the economy, that means it's impossible that Brexit could have also damaged the economy. Believing that makes you literally stupid. But the maths actually makes that worse, because the government's own experts have said that the damage that COVID has done long term is not as bad as the damage that Brexit has done. So any journalist that's willing to make excuses for the government by pointing to global issues that are outside of their control, like COVID, but isn't willing to mention Brexit, which has done twice as much damage, and the government did choose that, is effectively a mouthpiece for the Tories. And because Labour is still, by omission, supporting Brexit too, them not mentioning Brexit helps Labour as well. So as Kay Burley said,
I am a Tory and a Labour mouthpiece in equal measure.
We are being made poorer by a duopoly under the Tories and Labour. The way to change that is by changing the voting system to one where the seats in Parliament match the votes of the people. Fortunately, the members of the Labour Party overwhelmingly want that. They voted for it. So when Keir Starmer takes power, our job is to work with them to force him to give it to us. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a great week.